The title is A Graphic Journey from Bengal to Ohio. Anand Chatterjee, the floor is yours.
All right, unmuted. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Toastmaster. Thank you, Junaid. And thanks everyone for being here today. There's my first thought. In the summer of 2019, I got my very first big boy job out in rural Ohio. And I took the money from that very first paycheck and I made a point to drive 2 hours south into Columbus, Ohio. I was looking for a very particular store. It was called The Laughing Ogre, and it's a shop that only sells comic books. Before I go any further, I should probably introduce myself. So my name is Anoon. That's the English pronunciation, at least. It rhymes with moon. And like Junaid said, I joined Toastmasters to become a better storyteller. And this is the story of why it was so important for me to go to a comic book store instead of something like IKEA. The rest of my 23-year-old peers would probably have taken that first paycheck to somewhere like that. But what was this pilgrimage the fruition of? See, as long as I can remember, I spent every summer in India, which is kind of the worst time to be in India. It's already a pretty hot place, but on top of that, I was there in the summer. It was sweltering. But I had family in West Bengal. And my best friend in India was my grandmother. That's my mom's mom. And she would make the most of those 3 months she had me every year. She'd take me shopping with her. She'd let me follow her around as she was praying. And I would follow her around as she would yell at the stall owners to buy mangoes and vegetables and flowers for her prayers. And since she was a doting grandma, every so often she'd ask me, "Khalna kinbi," which is Bengali for, "Do you want to buy a toy?" Eventually, her question changed to "Boy kinbi," which is Bengali for, "Do you want to buy a book?" Because everyone had figured out by the time I was 7 that I was a massive bookworm. And my parents and my grandma were very happy to feed this addiction. Every few days, we'd head out in the evening. Sometimes we'd take a rickshaw. And after she'd bought the fruits and the flowers for the next day, she'd turn to me. She'd have a glint in her eye. And she'd ask me, "Boi kinbi? Chal, boyer dokhane chal," which is Bengali for, "You want to buy a book? Come on, let's go to the bookstore." At first, it was just children's issues, story collections, that kind of thing, general knowledge, nothing too special. But one day, I saw a book called Nonte Fonte. It was a collection of comic strips, similar to newspaper comic strips that you would see in America. And they were drawn by a local Bengali artist. I don't know if you'd believe me, but I had actually never read comics as a kid before. And on that day, my grandma bought me my very first comic book. And from that day, I was hooked. Every summer, I'd collect a few more comic books under my grandma's auspices. It was something about that visual printed medium. I loved it. And for 2 decades now, I have been thoroughly in love with graphic novels and comic books. Every time she'd call out, "Boy kinbi," I'd light up and I'd get to come home with something new, and it was fantastic. Around 2006, those Bengali bookstores in Howrah, which is the area that she lived, they actually started to carry reissues of American comic books, which was great. They're a little different from the ones you would get in America. In America, comic books are about this long, and they have very thin waxed paper, but those books don't do very well in the humid conditions in India. So the books in India would be about this big, and they'd have thicker paper stock to hold up to that humid weather. But they would reissue all the classic American comic books, Superman, X-Men, Spider-Man, all of it. And some of them would even be in Hindi or Bengali. And that was a great way for me to connect with my heritage of being both an American and an Indian, because you really haven't read Superman until you've read it in Bengali. It's a real trip. It was a great system that she and I had worked out. I got to feed my comic book addiction, and she got to dote on her only grandson. But unfortunately, all good things come to an end. After I entered college, I went back to India less and less. It went from being every summer to maybe every other summer. And then I started grad school, and I really couldn't go back at all. Right at the end of grad school, when I was finishing my thesis in the fall of 2018, she was fighting bladder cancer. And I wanted to go visit her because we all had a sense that she was nearing the end. And unfortunately, she didn't make it. She passed away before I finished my thesis, and I didn't get to see her in those last moments. And it really tore me up inside, knowing that I'd missed her final moments, knowing that I'd never go shopping for mangoes with her again, or that she'd never buy me another comic book. So when I secured my first Toastmasters job 5 months after that, I knew exactly what I had to do. So I made that pilgrimage. It felt like the fruition of decades of grandmother and grandson bonding. I walked into that comic book store, and in the back of my head, I heard her say, "Yeah, boy can be the." Thank you for listening, everyone. Back to you, Junaid.